For lesson 10, we're going to use distributive property again, and this time we're also going to factor using distributive property. So the first thing I'm going to do is just review us on greatest common factor. So I want to find the greatest common factor of 10 and 15. So one way to do that is to list all the factors of each number. So if we start with 1, well, what does 1 multiply to get 10? 10. And then we look to see, is 2 a factor of 10? Yes. 2 times what? Well, 2 times 5. And then I check for 3. 3 is not a factor. 4 is not a factor. And so we've met the in between the 2 and 5. So my factors of 10 are 1, 2, 5, and 10. I'm going to do the same process for 15. So 1 is always the factor, and so 1 times 15. We pair those up. I check for 2. Since 15 is an odd, 2 is not a factor. 3 is. 3 times 5. And then the only thing to check in between the 3 and 5 is 4, and 4 is not a factor of 15. So now I look to see what is a common factor of them. Well, they do both share a common factor of 1, but the greatest common factor is the 5. So I'm going to write that here. I'm going to use that greatest common factor of 5 down here in the next problem. So notice this 10 plus 15 are the two numbers that we had that we were finding the greatest common factor of. So I'm putting the greatest common factor here, 5. It's what's sitting out in front of the parentheses. Yesterday it did not show a multiplication symbol here. Your practice problems today show that, so that's why I'm showing the multiplication symbol. So this needs to multiply back. Well, 5 times what gives us that 10? 2. So I'm going to write the other way to think of that. So 10, our original number, divided by the greatest common factor is how we're getting that number. And then the 15, well, 5 times what would give us that 15? 3. Or you can look at that number 15 and divide or factor out the greatest common factor, 5. So what we're doing is we're finding the greatest common factor of the two numbers, and we're putting it here. Then we're dividing these two numbers by the greatest common factor and putting them in the last two spots. Okay, let's try another one. It may seem confusing at first, but just stay with me. So this time we're working with 30 and 36, so I need to find the factors of those and then determine the greatest common factor. So 1 will pair with 30. 30 is an even number, so 2 will go in there. 2 times 15. You can use a calculator if you need to check to see if numbers are a factor, or you can use your multiplication chart. 3 is also a factor, 3 times 10. If I test for 4, it would have a remainder, so that is not a factor. If I test for 5, anything that ends in a 0, 5 is a factor. And 5 times 6. Well, when this side meets the larger numbers, then we're done. So we've got the factors of 30. Now I'm going to repeat that process for 36. So 1 times 36. It's an even number, so 2 will work. If you weren't sure what it was, then just you could take your calculator and do 36 divided by 2. 3 will also work, 3 times 12. 4 also is a factor, 4 times 9. 5 will not go in there, but 6 will, and it's 6 times itself, 6 times 6, so I only have to write that one time. Okay, so I'm looking for some common factors. It might actually help to just start with the bigger numbers and move back. So if I'm checking here, 30, that's not in the other row. 15 is not a factor of 36. 10 is not a factor. 6 is. So I'm going to circle that, and that's my greatest common factor. I'm going to put that here. So I'm factoring out their biggest factor. Their biggest factor was 6, so that's going here. Well, remember this needs to distribute out to these numbers. So I'm looking here. 30 divided by 6 is 5, and then 36 divided by 6 is 6. Well, let's check that using distributive property. So if I do 6 times 5, that gives me back the 30, and then 6 times 6 is 36, which gives me back that number. Okay, let's go to the next example. Find the greatest common factor of 4 and 8. So 1 times 4, and then 2 times 2, so I only have to list it one time. 8 would be 1 times 8. 2 times 4, and 3 does not work, and that's the only thing in between the 2 and the 4 to check. So I'm looking for common factors. So they both have 1, 2, but 4 is their greatest common factor. So I'm going to put that here and here. So I'm factoring out their greatest common factor. We'll check this in a minute using our distributive property. Let's figure out what goes inside there. So I'm taking this first number, 4, dividing it by our greatest common factor of 4, and that's 1. And then our second number, the 8, and dividing it by the greatest common factor. 8 divided by 4 is 2. Okay, let's check that using our distributive property. Whoops. So 4 times 1 is 4, and then 4 times 2 is 8. So that does check. The last thing we want to look at today is using distributive property to remove parentheses. So we haven't seen any the previous lesson and this one with variables. Remember, variables in math usually look like letters. They represent a number. In this case, we do not know what the variables are worth, but we can still use our distributive property to remove those parentheses. So I'm going to distribute the 7 to the W and also to the 5. Remember, the 7 is being shoved next to the set of parentheses, so that means multiplication. So 7 times W, I'm just going to write that with them shoved together because that means they're being multiplied. If this says addition here, then I'll be using addition over here. And then the 7's also being distributed to the 5. So 7 times 5 is 35. And that would be the final answer to that. We're using that distributive property to remove the parentheses. Okay, let's try the next example. 9 times 7 is 63. I'm keeping the subtraction symbol that was given to us. 9 times W. When you shove them together, it shows multiplication, and we put the number in front of the variable when we shove those together. Okay, let's distribute on the next one. So 5 times 4 is 20, plus 5 times C is 5C. Okay, and our last example here, again, use distributive property. 8 times 3 is 24, and then 8 times M is 8M. It was subtraction shown over here, so again, I'm using subtraction in this section. So some of this can seem confusing, so it would probably be a good idea to look back through our examples again. So kind of pause the video, look back through all of them, and then go ahead and try your practice problems for today. So lesson 10, distributive property and factoring.